Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 52. You tune into the news after a long day, hoping for clarity on the challenges we're facing as a country. But rather than information, what you find is one urgent crisis after another, with few solutions and even fewer chances for optimism. Instead of helping us understand the complexities, much of this coverage seems to be designed to keep us watching, and to keep us anxious. As the news networks drive up this constant outrage, one question grows more pressing. Are we finally getting sick of it? Polls show a stark dip in trust in media, with fewer than one-third of Americans believing that the news is presented in a fair, accurate, and balanced way. Numbers from Gallup reveal that 39% of Americans don't trust the media at all. And it's not just mistrust. Many are tuning out altogether. Ratings at the major cable news networks have dropped even for breaking news, while print and digital subscribers to newspapers are also declining. More and more young people are abandoning traditional news sources entirely, turning instead to social media or simply avoiding the news. This steady decline in trust isn't just about partisanship either. It's a result of news cycles that highlight problems without offering any constructive answers. The mainstream media often leaves audiences feeling helpless, enraged by the state of the world, but with no clear direction on how to change it. Instead, the outrage builds with no outlet, creating an echo chamber that reinforces partisan beliefs and stokes a sense of powerlessness. So, how did we get here, and what can we do to escape this cycle of outrage and misinformation? To explore these questions, we sought out someone with years of experience studying media and culture, someone who has dedicated their career to understanding the fine line between information and manipulation.
This is Andrew Selepak, professor at the University of Florida. At UF, I teach my students about social media, media and politics, sports media, and media writing.
Andrew Selepak, media professor and expert on the psychology of news, knows just how much is at stake. In our conversation, he explores not only why our media has drifted into these dangerous waters, but also the deep human reasons that keep us glued to every headline and what that could mean for our democracy. In the conversation ahead, we'll reveal the media industry's playbook, the psychology behind our outrage addiction, and the real consequences of a world where news and entertainment have become indistinguishable. So join us as we step behind the scenes of today's media landscape with someone who knows its impact inside and out. All right, well, Andrew Selepak, thank you so much for making time to come on our program.
I appreciate you having me.
So I thought we could just chat. I saw your article in The Hill, Are We Finally Getting Sick of Media Outrage Machine? And the numbers don't lie. So I'm sort of hoping that's true, that we're getting sick of it, because I have a whole podcast about that. And, we've cited a lot of those numbers here, particularly the things about sort of lack of trust in, a loss of trust in media. And also, of course, we talked a bit also about the sort of the segment sizes of these audiences have shrunk. And so they're getting more desperate. I was curious about this, that are these audiences shrinking because they're too partisan or they're not partisan enough?
I think that the audiences for mainstream traditional media are shrinking because they are partisan. And, they aren't doing probably the most important thing, which I think is journalism. If you turn on the 24-hour news networks, it's just talking heads, it's just giving opinions. And I think that's really a disservice to the audience, to the people, to the voters. We are not informed, and we're not informed yet have very deep, very passionate opinions, and we're still voting, yet we don't really know why we're voting for someone other than a letter next to their name.
Yeah, and that's a good point about journalism too, because we also kind of don't know what journalism is and what it isn't anymore because of this, just the way everything's sort of become an opinion now.
Well, and it's true, because if you think about, I'm a huge supporter, and I think everyone should be, of the First Amendment and all the different aspects of the First Amendment, from freedom of speech to freedom of the press. And the founders knew from the beginning that we would have a partisan press. We had a partisan press when they were writing the Constitution. But there was an expectation on the part of the founders that individuals would consume, at that time, newspapers, obviously. They would consume newspapers, pamphlets, books that had opinions different than the ones that they had, and that we would reach a consensus, and that you could literally bring together people with very different opinions from Massachusetts and Virginia and the Georgia colony and Pennsylvania. And you could bring them together and come up with this written document. And they had an expectation that the people of this country would do the same and have that sort of consensus politics, which is only built on understanding the issues and understanding different sides of the issues. And we're just not getting that anymore. We're sitting in filter bubbles. We're consuming partisan media. If you look at the audiences for the more centrist media, they often are relatively small. And most media continues to lean more left, lean more right, lean far left, lean far right. And people consume that content because of the sensational aspect behind it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was Jefferson who was kind of talking about how a big role of the media, like you say, it was newspapers mostly then, was sort of an accountability role, right, of holding politicians accountable.
And that's what the Fourth Estate is. The Fourth Estate is supposed to be a watchdog on, the three branches of government. The Fourth Estate concept coming from England being, there a check on Parliament, the nobility, and the commoners. Here, it's about our three branches of government and sort of representing the people and protecting the people. And to a large extent, I would argue that it's not holding up to its end of the bargain, because we do have, just sometimes massive corruption from our elites, from our politicians, from our government, from, the big and powerful businesses, the big tech companies. And, for the average person, they don't have the time, inclination, or ability to kind of understand and be able to research all these different things. And there's such a tremendous need for true journalism, and particularly investigative journalism, to really delve deep into these topics and these people and to reveal corruption where it exists. And I think that's especially what we're not getting on, if we just look at the 24-hour news networks. There's no investigative reporting in there. It's 2, 3, 4 people sitting at a desk, talking about their thoughts and feelings. Well, I can get that anywhere. I don't need to watch the news to just get thoughts and opinions from people.
Yeah, I mean, that's the biggest thing I see. You see a lot of people sort of talking about, they're telling me this lie or that lie, and there may be some of that, but much more. It's just they're just leaving out so much, right? They're just trying to make the story a lot more black and white or simplified than it really is.
And part of that's the constraints of the industry itself. I mean, if you think about, you've got to have commercial breaks. So if you have a commercial break every 5 minutes, you're not giving a lot of depth and detail to a particular story. And it's one of the reasons why, I view social media as having tremendous potential. I recognize the dystopian reality of social media, but I also believe in the potential of social media, where we have the opportunity to consume longer form content and consume content that really goes in more depth and detail on some of these issues.
Yeah, I mean, that's one reason why I started a podcast, and also or I chose a podcast as the format, because we can dive in a little deeper. And you are seeing that. I mean, you're seeing some of the reporting, some of the studies on that showing that people prefer that option because they get they get to go deeper.
And as I tell my students, nobody wants to be an idiot. Nobody wants to be among their group of friends and they're talking about an issue and you have nothing to contribute. You just kind of sit there shaking your head. Everybody wants to feel smart. And it's really hard to do that when you're getting just short sound bites, you're getting sort of brief minute and a half stories, or you're just getting sort of that horse race journalism of, well, in these states, Donald Trump is up in the poll. But if you look at this poll, none of that means anything. They're not talking about the issues. They're not talking about the reality. It's a big part of it, again, just talking about the industry itself, is the lack of money in it. I mean, journalism takes time. It costs money. Doing investigative journalism takes a lot of time. And that's a huge investment for something that might not pay off. Whereas putting 2 people in a studio, putting a camera on them, having them just talk about their opinions is cheap and easy. And, CNN really kind of was the first one to put that format out there with Crossfire, decades ago. And they've all kind of sort of copied that model since then and really focusing on the 24-hour networks. But they've kind of put investigative journalism to the side. And then for newspapers, as they've seen their advertising revenue dwindle because of digital and not getting those digital subscribers, they can't afford, a Woodward and Bernstein spending an entire year investigating a story. That salary could be replaced by some, college grad who knocks out 5 stories a day just to give them content.
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge. I mean, yeah, I think that's another reason why you get some strange sort of alternatives, because there are people that can put that kind of time in, but are they doing good journalism?
Well, and that leads to a question of even, and maybe if we had a broader, if we go even broader with this, what is journalism these days? Would you consider Joe Rogan to be journalism? I mean, he talks about stories, he talks about issues, he brings on guests. Is now the return of Jon Stewart to The Daily Show? Is Jon Stewart a journalist? What really defines a journalist? Like, we know what defines a doctor or a lawyer. They pass the bar, they pass their medical exams. There's a qualification process for certain positions. But for a journalist, there's no certificate from the government. There's no certificate that you get that qualifies you as a journalist. And from that perspective, where anybody can, you don't need a background in it. You can literally have people who are White House press secretaries, and then they leave the job the next day. They have a journalism show on a 24-hour news network. Well, what to say that they're qualified for that position? We would never, in considering how important and vital it is for our democracy, we wouldn't give the same sort of ease away to a doctor or a lawyer and say, well, you've watched some YouTube videos, so clearly you can perform, my heart surgery now. But for some of these people that we kind of quantify or consider to be journalists or newsmakers, there's really no sort of qualification process for them, but a lot of people still trust them for information.
Right. And that gets back to something we were talking about in the beginning a little bit about, we're not really, there's not really a good awareness of what sort of real journalism looks like, where you actually have editors and there's a process and there's some vetting of sources and things like that. And I technically don't have an editor. Nobody's really vetting my sources. It's relying on me to do that. So, you've got to try to build some trust with your audience. And I'm taking journalism classes from Michigan State, but I don't have an editor. So I'm in the same boat. Like I can make choices that I don't even realize that I'm making probably, and make some biased choices in there. But, that's something I think we often don't appreciate about, classic journalism, where you have that process and that kind of institutional fact checking sort of going on.
And I've spent 6 years teaching radio journalism, and it's one of the reasons why I'm comfortable doing a podcast, because I have a face for radio. But, having taught radio journalism for 6 years and having done radio journalism myself, I mean, it is one of those things where it's sort of up to the ethics of the station, the ethics of your news director, and then personal ethics as well. And sometimes personal ethics take a backseat to our own bias, our own beliefs. It can be very difficult. You could have a really important story to do with an important newsmaker, but maybe on a personal level, you don't like that person. They snubbed you. They did something to insult you. And it's literally human nature to then maybe not treat them entirely fairly or entirely objectively. And that's a very human quality. And it happens, I think, everybody who's a journalist at some point. But the training, I think, is valuable. It's important. And I think what's also necessary is for us to kind of have the recognition of what journalism should be and its role in our society. And we, as much as we've already kind of touched on that, I mean, there are very few professions that have a more important place in our society than journalism. I mean, we are entrusted to vote. We're entrusted to run for office. We're entrusted to understand how the political process works, for it to be explained to us. And we can leave that up to K through 12 education. And we could spend as much time talking about K through 12 education as we are about this. But the rest of it's left up to journalists. And that makes it so important in a society like ours that we need to have good quality journalism. And however you want to define that, that's a whole different discussion. But at its core is why it's so necessary. Because, for me, I guess a kind of a great awakening was sort of COVID and the misinformation and disinformation going around about COVID, and recognizing I don't know what the truth is, and I can't seem to get the truth anywhere. And that, to me, what was sort of where it was a recognition of, okay, how do we come up with this, and where are we getting our information, and how do we trust who we trust? And coming to the recognition, myself, as according to most metrics would be considered an educated person. I have 3 college degrees. I think that gives me some semblance of being an educated person. But for others, it could be a much more difficult process, and it becomes too important, especially when it comes to financial decisions, medical decisions, when it comes to making a decision about who should be our mayor, our governor, our senator, our congressperson, our president, who decides who's on the Supreme Court. And it's journalists who make us an informed citizenry.
Yeah, and so that takes me to, with this, the way that people are getting frustrated with the news and sort of this outrage. Well, I call it outrage porn. And so a lot of people have kind of opted out. And that obviously isn't necessarily a great answer either, because that can take you down some paths toward stuff that's just as bad, if not worse.
And what I'll say, I think I know where you're about to go. and what I'll say is, I think one of the big problems that we see with the traditional media is it is sensational. It is this outrage machine without ever offering solutions. It teaches you, Donald Trump is a fascist. Joe Biden is some Marxist Manchurian candidate. We're all screwed. Now go about your day and be angry. There's never and here's what you, John Q. Public, can go do. Here's how you can, go participate in local government. Here's how you can run for office yourself, participate in your school board, become a city councilor. Or here's how you can contribute to a campaign, or how you can start a political party, and I will be 100% honest. I don't have solutions. I don't have the silver bullet. If I did, you and I wouldn't be talking. I would be sitting on a money empire, because I've solved the world's problems, and I'm not there yet. But that's, I think, and like I said, just I had an idea of where we were going, but I think with the traditional media, that's just been a huge problem of, it's not about being able to provide people solutions, which is a release valve. If I think everything's going to hell, and you're just telling me how much closer we're getting to the precipice of hell without giving me any tools or any knowledge or any skills or any advice on how to pull it back from the precipice, other than, well, keep listening after the break, or buy the products you're going to hear and see between this, the show now, when we come back from break. It doesn't seem to be about solutions. It reminds me of years ago, Rush Limbaugh said that, he was basically just selling products, and that his show was filler in between advertisements. It wasn't about offering solutions. He would claim to be an entertainer. And I think that's what we're getting a lot from the news, is just entertainment, not infotainment, not even infotainment. It's just pure entertainment these days.
Yeah, and it's worse than that, I think, because people start to take these messages and kind of run with them, because the solution you sort of are left with is, we must sort of destroy or eliminate the other side because they're just evil and going to destroy the country or whatever, right? And we start to sort of believe that stuff. We kind of hear that narrative, and we don't have a better answer. Somehow we must just destroy them in the electoral process. And it's not realistic, right? It's setting an expectation that's doomed to fail, because we live in the actual reality is like a 50% plus one reality, right? I mean, you're not going to have those kind of majorities, especially not for some sustained amount of time. So I think it's setting us up for some really bad failures. And then when we don't have that electoral victory that we sort of dreamed about, we get really mad about it, and it kind of just becomes this spiral.
And what it causes, when you consume heavily partisan or echo chamber partisan media, you're dealing with people in two different realities. And in my reality, there is the truth. And you can't understand the reality of the other person. And then combined with this sort of outrage that's being fed by my reality of the other side is evil. So there's no way to compromise. There's no way of forming a consensus when people are living in two different truths and view the opposition as evil. I can't understand them and they're evil. And the mindset that can create can become exceedingly dangerous when you view the opposition or people who believe different than you are bringing us to this, precipice of hell. So you can think people say, oh, we're most divided we've ever been. Luckily, we're not. The 1860s really would kind of, stand up and say, hey, I think we were more divided, at this point than you are in 2024. But, if you want to put on a tinfoil hat and start conspiracy theorying it a little bit, you could see where, okay, how far away are we from that potentially when we can't view somebody simply because they have a different opinion on immigration or abortion as being a good person, but instead we view them as evil. And that's a really dangerous position because of the potential fallout and the potential end result that can create.
Yeah, it's a bad path because now you can start justifying some pretty bad means to get these glorious, morally superior ends, right? That's a good baseline to work with as to what lens to apply to this content. I often tell people to sort of try to figure out what they're not telling you, what they leave out.
and that's a huge part of it as well, because that's intention. And again, there's an aspect of there is a kind of industry impact, when you think about the fact of if you turn on the local news, the 5 o'clock news, 11 o'clock news, it's not everything that happened that day. It is not everything that happened in your neighborhood that day. It's not even a fully detailed version of everything that happened in your neighborhood that day. Decisions have to be made if we can cover this, but not cover this. We'll give this much time or space to this and this much time and space. This is our top story, front page story. All those are decisions that are needed to be made by somebody. But they, again, have their own bias and perspectives and the stories that they think are better to tell and the stories they think that would be better, the reporters they think would be better to tell them. And it's not, and this is why I think when you have these kind of conversations, I think these conversations are great. And we need more like the one you and I are having right now. Not just you and I, but everybody. I think the big thing that we keep missing is, and I've mentioned this once already, there is no silver bullet. There's no one thing that's going to solve this. And I was teaching a media and politics class in the fall, and I got 3/4 of the way through, and I had a conversation with my students, and I said, I think there's something up there that we're trying to see. It's like looking at the Sistine Chapel, but there's a part that's missing, and I can't see this part that's missing. And because I can't see this part that's missing, I can't explain the whole Sistine Chapel. I can explain parts of it, but there's something that I can't see. And I think for all of us, there's something we can't see. And that's why there's no one is fully knows, and therefore no one can come up with a solution that's going to solve it all. There's no silver bullet that's going to make us all better informed, make journalism better, make us less partisan, bring us together, create consensus. Help let us treat others as we want to be treated. Because if there was, someone smarter than I would have come up with it by now.
Yeah, and it's always a uncomfortable reality when you have to face that, because TV, Hollywood has always taught us you can solve this problem in 17 and a half minutes and and there's some bad guy.
And then I can ride off into the sunset wearing my white hat. Yeah, and that's a very American media type of a thing, that goes back to the original films, the cowboy, the Western, the original radio shows. The protagonist defeats the antagonist and rides off into the sunset and close and happy ending. It all works out in the end. And, that's not reality. That's Hollywood. But it doesn't mean, though, that we don't make that the goal. And again, that's why we have these conversations that you and I are having of, okay, It seems impossible, but if we don't try, if we don't keep trying, if we don't keep trying to think of a solution and work on solutions and not think that there's one simple thing, there's one magic pill that's going to solve it all, but it's a holistic approach that's going to take a lot of us to do, man, what's the point of all of this? Like, if we're not trying, if we're not reaching, if we're not trying to put something together, just give up, go live in a cave and wait till the sweet release of death, because that's not what human nature is. Human nature is pushing that boulder up a hill, knowing you're not going to get to the top, but you keep going anyhow because there's the belief that it's possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Well, I think with that, Dr. Selepak, we'll wrap it up. So yeah, Andrew Selepak, thank you so much for coming on our show. I really appreciate you making the time.
Thank you.
And that is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you enjoyed this episode, if you found it interesting, please tell some friends about it. Post it to your social media. Better yet, text someone. Even better, talk to someone in real life. Tell them about this show. I really appreciate it. Okay, see you in a week or two.